The Ice Age series is one that infamously went on for way too long and is still going, to the point that, as I noted in a previous video, may have even retroactively tainted how people view the original because of how much their quality declined over the years. Because no matter how bad its sequels were, nothing can change the fact that the original Ice Age was actually a very good movie. But even more than that, its sequel, Ice Age The Meltdown, arguably suffers from this as well. Because while not quite on par with the original movie, it actually serves as a pretty good follow-up to it and makes for easily the best sequel in the series. And today, I'd like to go over why Ice Age The Meltdown is a worthy follow-up to Ice Age and doesn't deserve to be lumped in with the much less stellar movies in the franchise. And obviously there will be spoilers for both Ice Age and The Meltdown ahead, so in case you haven't seen either of them yet and don't want to know how they end, please come back to this video another day. Okay, so to put it as simply as possible, in my video where I explained why the Ice Age series declined, which you can find a link in the description to, I went over all the different reasons why the franchise got worse with every passing installment, and as I even noted in that video, The Meltdown doesn't actually suffer from most of the problems I covered, because for one thing, it's arguably the only movie in the series that's actually a logical progression of the one preceding it, both in terms of the general plot and how the characters are handled. I mean, having Manny still coming to grips with the death of his original family while contemplating starting a new one after meeting the eccentric Ellie, despite not having completely moved on from them yet, is really not a bad progression of his character, particularly because it's the only time his old family is actually referenced in any way. But the movie also smartly doesn't just have Ellie show up and throw herself at him, but instead she has her own issues to work out, having been raised by possums and believing herself to be one, even though she's literally the size of an elephant, and shows how this complicates Manny's attempts to bond with her. And there's also Sid, who similarly put to good use is the heart and soul of the herd, being annoying but also the most well-meaning and helping to push his friends past their problems, particularly in trying to get Manny together with Ellie, and actually being the one to help Diego past his aquaphobia with a little white lie. And even if the scene where he's nearly sacrificed has no bearing on the plot, it's still pretty funny all the same. But I'll get back to that later. Really, the only outlier here is honestly Diego, as none of the Ice Age sequels really knew what to do with him. But even then, his having to deal with his fear of water wasn't the worst way to handle his character, and helps justify his presence in the narrative. It just wasn't the best progression of his character after everything he went through in the original either. In other words, more focus could have been placed on him, but what is done with him still does work. But on the flip side, and as I noted before, there's also that the movie's plot, which, apart from Continental Drift, is arguably the only Ice Age sequel to have a plot that would logically take place during the Ice Age and is appropriate for that period. Because if the first one was about, well, the Ice Age, then it's not unreasonable that the second would be about what happens when all that ice inevitably starts to melt. Though, of course, this being a kids' movie, everything turns out a lot better for the characters than they did in real life. But the point is, if one were asked in 2002 what a sequel to Ice Age should look like, this movie would actually be more or less right on the money, exploring both what happens when the Ice Age ends, as well as seeing Manny move on with his life by going on to have another family, even if it's difficult for him. Again, maybe it's not 100% perfect, but it's way better than anything that came afterwards. The plot actually halfway considers the original and tries to do right by it, and succeeds at that task better than it had any right to. It may contradict the post-credit scene of the first one, but as I noted in another video, which you can also find a link in the description to, it's debatable if that scene was ever meant to be anything more than a joke anyway. Though one of the most important mistakes made by later Ice Age movies that this one avoids is that it doesn't introduce a bunch of new characters that end up completely taking over the narrative and hog the spotlight. Because the only new characters of note are Ellie, Crash, and Eddie, with all others being minor characters that are very unintrusive and allow the focus to remain firmly on the characters from the first one and their interactions with the aforementioned trio. Heck, this even applies to the movie's villains, to the point that one could almost argue that they deserved a bit more screen time than they ultimately got. Seriously, compared to Soto and Captain Gut later on, these two aren't really up to snuff in the villains department and are a weaker element of the film. But to stay on topic, not only does a lack of new characters allow the movie to actually feel like an actual sequel because it stays centered on the characters the audience already knows, but it also allows for proper time to be centered on Ellie as well, because her initially believing herself to be a possum and is therefore unimpressed by Manny's behavior, only to come to realize the truth and the emotional confusion that follows is very well done, and allows the two of them getting together to come across very believably, because they've both changed since they first met, and those changes are very apparent to the viewer. And not to mention, Ellie acting like a possum despite being a gigantic woolly mammoth also makes for some of the funniest gags in the movie. And that's another thing that heavily works in the film's favor. It's actually funny, arguably even more so than his predecessor, because even apart from the aforementioned gags involving Ellie, there's also how plain awkward Manny behaves towards her for most of the runtime, which is actually pretty amusing, as well as that Crash and Eddie are put to perhaps their best use here, as they're not only actually really funny, where they just be annoying in later installments, but they actually have a bearing on the plot. Seriously, even though I've heavily argued for the importance of comic relief characters in another video, which you can also find a link in the description to, they really could have done a better job with these two in the coming sequels. Because things like the catapult scene are downright hilarious, and that's only scratching the surface of the laughs they have to offer. Though there's also such things as the aforementioned moment where a bunch of sloths try to sacrifice Sid to stop the melting, which is both horrifying and funny in equal measure. As well as the vultures randomly breaking out into the food song from Oliver in anticipation of everyone's deaths. Seriously, if there's one kids movie that knows how to deliver laughs in both conventional and surprisingly dark ways without ever overdoing it, this would be it. Now again, all of this isn't to say that Ice Age the Meltdown is perfect, because among other things, its villains are a bit underwhelming, and it just can't quite reach the effective emotional highs of the first one. But the point is that out of all of the Ice Age sequels, this one definitely comes the closest to recapturing what made the original so good and makes for a worthy follow-up to it. Maybe it's not the best sequel it could have been, but it definitely does justice to the original, and above all doesn't take away from it like some of its later installments would, especially Ice Age Collision Course, which was frankly a complete embarrassment. But the point is, on several different fronts, Ice Age the Meltdown does have quite a bit to offer, as it avoids most of the mistakes its own sequels would make, tells a decently emotional story, and is actually pretty funny. So like I already said, on the whole, Ice Age the Meltdown may not be the best sequel ever made, and can't compare to the first, but especially when judged alongside its sequels, is absolutely nothing to be ashamed of either. Alright, that's everything I wanted to cover. So now I'd like to hear from all of you. Do you believe that Ice Age the Meltdown is a worthy sequel to the original Ice Age and easily the best follow-up in the franchise? Or do you think it's just as bad as the sequels that came after it and has nothing to offer at all? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. Because like always, you don't have to agree with any opinions expressed in this video that you don't want to. You can feel about Ice Age the Meltdown and how good of a sequel it is however you'd like, and I nor anybody else can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. I very appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.